I think the question for me is if we do go or when we go to the metaverse, we have to think about how do we operate as HR within the metaverse, as opposed to just saying this is my recruitment process when it runs, in the face-to-face world. This is what it looks like when it's automated. This is now what it's going to look like in the metaverse. Because I think some of those things will be very, very different, and we shouldn't just try, and fit it in because the metaverse is a nice and sexy new channel for us to explore.
Hello everyone and welcome to HR Hot Topics. This is the show in which Dieter Veldsman and I, Eric van Vulpen, talk about some of the stories that we read in the news in the past month, and we discuss their impact on the world of work and the impact on us as HR professionals. Let's dive right in. And our big story is about a day in the life at the Meta workplace. And it essentially describes how in the future we might and candidates might interact with organizations through the metaverse. And the article gives a couple of examples. For example, candidates exploring potential different workplaces in the metaverse or going to job fairs, fully in the metaverse. So you don't have to get out of the building. You put your goggles on and you're there and you're talking with recruiters. But also office-based assessments and also in-person meetings, they will start to happen in the metaverse. So the metaverse will start to affect the way we manage people and the way we work in HR. So what is the metaverse is then the common question, Let's define what we're talking about. The metaverse is essentially a virtual space that people access digitally and you can interact with other users. And the office environment leans itself very well for being in the metaverse, so we can interact with one another even though we're not sitting next to one another. Dieter, my question is, do you see HR moving into the metaverse anytime soon?
Well, I think, Eric, the question is probably not if we will move. The question for me is more around how will we move into the metaverse? What should happen in person? What should happen in this alternate reality? And how do we transition in a way that there's still human connection with regards to that? So I don't know what your thought is. Do you think HR will fully go into the metaverse, or do you think, kind of like it is at the moment, it will be activity-based and certain things like a conference or a job fair or an interview? Or do you think we'll hang out at the water cooler in the metaverse anytime soon?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, Dieter. I'm a little bit torn on this. I think on the one hand, if it's, a temporary onboarding and people are working remote because of COVID or other issues, it's a fully remote working person, I think having VR goggles and being in the metaverse could be a good way of connecting, because we all know the stories of people joining new companies in lockdown and they don't meet anyone and they're miserable and they're lonely. And I think that the metaverse can help out. At the same time, I wonder if it's not a little bit of an overhyped thing. I think when VR goggles came in first, I think about 5 or 10 years ago, everyone was talking about, this will revolutionize learning and development, and people will now use augmented reality in order to do their training and their onboarding. And I think still very few companies are doing it. So I'm wondering, is it not a bit of a hype?
I think what we do need to consider there, though, is that I think there's some huge barriers to entry in terms of companies really shifting towards the metaverse. I think there's things like, affordability on the one end, but also just access to, can I call it, foundational technology that makes something like this a reality. I think we're probably in a better situation now than what we were before COVID, because I think a lot of those things have developed and people had to adapt overnight, which I think does open the conversation a lot better. But I'm also a little skeptic about the fact that, at the morning when I get to work, I go into the metaverse, and when I leave, I go out of the metaverse. I can definitely see its utilization in terms of specific initiatives or specific places we want to bring people together. And I mean, just to share from my side, I've been in a few metaverse-orientated conferences, really enjoyed it, but I wouldn't want to live there, kind of 40, 50 hours a week. I don't necessarily think that that's the right way for us to go about that. So I think the question then for HR is also one of inclusion. How do we make sure people are included within the metaverse if we do decide to go that particular way, and not excluded due to the fact that the technology excludes as opposed to includes them on the one side? I think it also then brings some really interesting questions around ethical conduct and behavior. Because if my avatar does something wrong, is that me or is it me in the metaverse? And how do we deal with that if something untoward happens?
I think that's a great question. I would say, the same rules that we have in workplace conduct, I think they should be mirrored somehow in the metaverse. But I think you bring up an interesting topic when you talk specifically about, it's a high barrier of entry. And I think that also means that for individual employees, that means, do we have all the means, to go into the metaverse? Maybe we get the goggles from our employer, but do we also have the bandwidth, the internet speed in order to function well in the metaverse. And I think there's also a risk of, when we talk about equality, there's a risk of people who are highly tech savvy, who jump into the metaverse, understand everything immediately, and do a conference like you and I did a while ago. And there's people who may be less comfortable in that environment, and they may have a major step, be at a major disadvantage in that sense. So in the end, it's important that we also educate people that they have the relevant skills in order to function well in the metaverse and not be totally lost in a new experience where they are very, very uncomfortable.
I agree with that, and I want to take it back to when everybody started working remotely, and whether you were using Teams or Zooms or another platform doesn't really matter. But we almost try to duplicate exactly what we did in person into this, now remote working environment. And I still think we haven't quite sufficiently adapted to the fact that, a virtual meeting runs differently than a meeting face to face. There's different things we need to think about in terms of personal cues and behavioral things we need to pick up. In my experience, virtual meetings tend to be a lot more assertive and directive, and that's just the nature of how we will communicate with regards to that. So I think the question for me is, if we do go, or when we go to the metaverse, we have to think about how do we operate as HR within the metaverse, as opposed to just saying, this is my recruitment process when it runs, in the face-to-face world. This is what it looks like when it's automated. This is now what it's going to look like in the metaverse. Because I think some of those things will be very, very different, and we shouldn't just try, and fit it in because the metaverse is a nice and sexy new channel for us to explore. That's going to take some thought from us as an HR point of view. Don't know your thoughts on that.
No, absolutely. I think a major consideration of that is also making sure that for everyone the experience is the same, because you will have candidates who are coming in the office and who have a face-to-face conversation, and at the same time you have candidates who are in the metaverse and trying to make a digital impression. And I do have the fear that these two different candidates may last a very different impression, even though they're highly similar candidates, simply because, you are able to touch one person, you're able to sit across the table of one person, and the other person is an avatar that is dressed, you don't even know how the avatar is dressed. I think it is, in terms of procedural justice and having the rights and the similar procedures when it comes to kind of a hybrid version between in-person and working in the metaverse, I think is incredibly important. And I'm also a little bit concerned about, some of the plans that now companies like Meta are having about commercializing the metaverse, where you talk, for example, about avatars. Are you able to, buy a suit for your avatar and, by just having more money, look better in the metaverse as well? Or will it be a place that equalizes everyone and everyone is dressed the same, but maybe that loses personality. So I think there's a lot of these interesting detailed choices that we need to make as organizations in order to make the metaverse work well.
Well, does the CEO still have a corner office in the metaverse? And do I still need to knock, or can I actually just walk in and be able to engage with that particular individual? So I think it does become quite interesting around when we start unpacking the reality of how that would play out. Beyond just the infrastructure requirements. I think there's some real questions for us also to ask around, and I love the example you used. We have to ask questions around unconscious bias all of a sudden, because I think it might be a lot more natural for some personality types, the two of us engaging versus, it's two avatars talking to each other. Maybe I'm more comfortable in the digital world. Maybe I portray myself differently. And I think it still has to come back to the fact that what's our values as a company? What's the culture we want to create? And how are we going to connect and engage with our employees via all these different channels? Something I sometimes wonder about is I think in the future we might spend a lot more time just trying to find where people are at the moment, as opposed to really engaging. Are they at the physical office? Are they in a co-located workspace? Are they currently in the metaverse? Are they in a Zoom room or in a Teams room or in a Teams call? At some stage, I think we just need to define almost a bit of our employee connection strategy. And those things have to filter into the practicalities of how we work and how we help people to understand what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Wearing my dark side HR hat for a moment, I think there's a multitude of ethical things we need to consider in the metaverse. What if your avatar does something to my avatar? Or, you steal my suit jacket that I just bought in the metaverse. What does that mean? Does it mean you've taken something from me? It's a silly example, but these things will start popping up, definitely.
I love what you're saying about an employee connection strategy. I think that is something that we as HR professionals should start thinking about more and more as the metaverse becomes omnipresent, essentially. And I really, really hope that, we don't have people literally sitting in an office in the metaverse and then working while, people at home have these VR goggles on. Now, Dieter, we interact with a lot of learners in our community, and one of our learners listeners, Megan, was asking, how do we build connection with people if we only interact digitally? And I think this question is very relevant to our story. What are your thoughts on this?
So I think, Eric, there's definitely a point here around, and we mentioned it, an employee connection strategy. And I think what we are seeing at the moment is really some people starting to experience a bit of loneliness, not necessarily being able to come into the office, or, hybrid work is not always fostering human connection. So I think there's something here around being intentional pertaining to the spaces we create where human beings can get together and why they get together. Previously we spoke about the fact that don't just get people into another Zoom room just because they have to be there, for the Friday afternoon drinks. But I do think on the other side, there is this point around to say, but what are those memorable moments that we want to create for employees that really fosters human connection? And maybe technology, the metaverse, maybe there's an opportunity for us there to look at some of these elements.
I think that's a great answer, Dieter. And we've had this discussion in the community and many other discussions. And if that's interesting for anyone who's listening, go to aihr.com to check out how you can access the community as well and join the discussion yourself.
But before you do that, remember to like and subscribe and let us know what you thought about today's conversation in the comments below.